A hot coffee cup collided with his face, scalding his skin, and the sharp, mocking laughter from the police officer echoed through the small diner. Just moments before, he'd entered the corner spot to grab his morning coffee, dressed sharply, confidently. Yet, the moment he walked through the door, he noticed the gaze of a uniformed cop shift toward him, dark with suspicion and something even more unsettling, contempt. "Hey, what are you doing here?" The officer's voice cut through the air, tone dripping with derision, loud enough for others to turn their heads. The words were loaded, as if his very presence was an offense, as if he didn't belong. The officer blocked his path to the counter, a smug grin spreading across his face, challenging him with a stare that spoke volumes. "People like you shouldn't act so bold." He took a slow breath, maintaining his composure. "I'm just here for coffee. Same as everyone else." But that answer wasn't enough for the officer, who stepped forward, bringing the steaming coffee cup dangerously close to his face. The patrons watched, some with pity, others too accustomed to scenes like this to react, while a few whispered to each other, eyes avoiding his. He was just another face to them, just another incident that would be soon forgotten. But for him, standing there, it was anything but routine, it was humiliating, a moment of pure degradation under a burning spotlight of racism. "Think you're special?" the officer sneered. "Think you can walk in here like you own the place?" His hand suddenly jerked forward, and the coffee splashed across his face. The pain was instant, a white-hot surge across his cheek and forehead, but it paled in comparison to the sting of the public humiliation. For an agonizing second, everything in the room went still. The officer smirked, satisfied, his message delivered loud and clear. This wasn't just about a cup of coffee. It was about power, control, a message that he could act without consequence, that he could strip a man of his dignity without hesitation. The patrons shifted uncomfortably, averted their gazes, and one or two even chuckled nervously, pretending to look at their phones. But none of them intervened, none dared challenge the officer who stood there with his arrogant stance, daring anyone to question him. And he stood, feeling the coffee cool on his skin, the eyes of the room heavy on him, each second dragging as his heart raced, every inch of his pride screaming in protest. He wanted to speak, to retaliate, to claim his right to dignity, but he knew the line was thin. This wasn't just a matter of words, any wrong move could turn the scene from humiliating to dangerous in an instant. He chose silence, letting the rage simmer inside him, his mind racing. What the officer didn't know, what no one in that diner could have guessed, was that he was no ordinary target. And this moment of humiliating, gut-wrenching injustice, would not be forgotten. The officer stepped back, laughing softly to himself, perhaps feeling he had done his duty, put someone like him in their place. But he had no idea who he was dealing with, the extent of the reach, the power that lay behind the calm mask of his target. As he turned to leave, a thought flickered in his mind: what if he hadn't stayed quiet? What if he'd revealed the truth right then and there, showed his badge, announced who he really was, the role he played in a world much larger than this diner? But he held back, watching the officer retreat, the smirk still plastered on his face, prideful and entirely ignorant of what was to come. That very day would set off a chain of events none of them could have imagined. One small act of arrogance and hate, one decision made in anger and ignorance, would lead to a reckoning that would shake the officer's life to its core. But as he left the diner, a single, pressing question lingered in his mind, a dark, burning thought: how far would this man's actions go if left unchecked? And could he bring justice not just for himself, but for every other person who had been humiliated in a similar way, forced to bear such cruelty in silence? The answer would unfold with shocking consequences, one the officer could never have anticipated. Hello to our incredible audience. Here at Plough of Twist, we believe in equality, respect, and standing up against any form of discrimination. Racism has no place here, and we want you to know we're with you, supporting justice and fairness every step of the way. We're here to share powerful stories that shed light on these issues and inspire change. Enjoy this gripping story, and if it resonates, don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you for being part of our community. The diner was small, one of those tucked-away places that relied on regulars and passers-by. The kind of place where conversations echoed easily, and everyone knew the face behind the counter. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and bacon grease, with wooden booths and faded, checkered floors that had seen their fair share of scuffs. It was a weekday morning, and the regulars were there, the retirees with their newspapers, a few office workers grabbing breakfast on their way to work, and a cop or two taking a break. Sitting in a corner booth, the officer was tall and broad-shouldered, his presence commanding. His name was Mike Hadley, a man known for his rigid stance on law and order, or at least his interpretation of it. Officer Hadley prided himself on being the authority, the one who could size up a man with a single look and know everything he needed to know about him. He had a square jaw, piercing blue eyes, and a gaze that felt as cold as it looked. He wore his uniform with a sense of entitlement, his fingers resting around his coffee mug, gaze flicking across the diner as though he were always on the lookout for something out of place. People had grown accustomed to his blunt approach, the way he spoke down to those he didn't respect, which was most everyone. In the eyes of those around him, Officer Hadley was a protector of his community, but he was also known for his harsh judgments, for seeing threats in places where there were none. His colleagues knew him as someone who rarely backed down and rarely questioned his instincts, even when they clashed with reason. His authority had rarely been challenged, at least in ways that left a mark. He was someone who held his beliefs as firmly as his badge, someone who felt justified in exerting his power when and where he saw fit. But this morning, he was about to encounter a man who didn't fit into his narrow view of the world. Across town, waking early with the morning sun, was Eric Miller. Eric wasn't a name that made headlines or drew attention, but he had a reputation of his own, one grounded in respect, not fear. Eric was an FBI agent, a man whose calm demeanor and sharp intellect were essential tools in his line of work. In his late 30s, he was tall and fit, with a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from within. Eric had grown up in tough neighborhoods, places where he learned resilience and strength from a young age. But his childhood, full of challenges and subtle battles against prejudice, had shaped him into someone who valued fairness and honesty above all else. Eric had faced his share of obstacles, each one met with patience and determination. He had made it his mission to bring justice to those who needed it most, and he carried his role as an FBI agent with the weight of someone who truly understood the responsibility. This job wasn't just a title to him, it was a way of righting wrongs, of protecting those who often found themselves on the other side of power. He was a husband, a father, and a man of deep principles, someone who fought tirelessly against the same prejudice he'd faced growing up. This morning, however, Eric wasn't thinking about work. He was just another man stopping for coffee, wearing a crisp button-up shirt, dark jeans, and a leather jacket, casual, unobtrusive. He liked this diner, having visited it a few times before, where the coffee was strong and the atmosphere relaxed. It was the kind of place that allowed him a quiet moment before the demands of the day set in. He pushed open the door, feeling the warmth of the diner's familiar atmosphere, unaware that his presence alone would trigger something in Officer Hadley. The moment he walked in, Eric noticed the police officer sitting in the corner booth. It wasn't the first time he'd encountered cops in casual settings, and he knew how to navigate those situations. In most cases, a polite nod or a quick greeting was enough to keep things moving, each going their own way. But there was something different this time, a subtle tension in the officer's gaze, the way his eyes narrowed as they focused on Eric. Hadley watched as Eric approached the counter, his face a mask of distaste. To him, Eric represented everything he distrusted. In that moment, Hadley's mind jumped to conclusions, assumptions fueled by stereotypes he held, assumptions that had little to do with Eric himself but everything to do with the officer's biases. "Can I help you with something?" Hadley's voice cut through the air, loud enough that it turned heads, his tone unmistakably confrontational. Eric paused, surprised by the tone but choosing not to engage immediately. He offered a polite smile. "Just here for coffee." Hadley's lips curled in a smirk, his fingers tightening around his mug. "Coffee, huh? Didn't think this was your kind of place. There it was, the implication. Eric recognized it instantly, the way people sometimes used subtle, cutting words to make someone feel unwelcome. But he'd dealt with men like Hadley before, and he had no intention of letting it disrupt his morning. He gave a simple nod and moved to place his order at the counter, ignoring the gaze boring into his back. But Hadley wasn't done. He stood up, leaving his half-empty mug behind, and crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, as if asserting his territory. When he stopped beside Eric, he made sure to block his view of the counter, forcing him to acknowledge his presence. "What's your name?" Hadley asked, his voice a low, mocking drawl. Eric looked at him, meeting his gaze, maintaining his calm. "Eric. Just Eric." Hadley's tone was thick with sarcasm, as though he'd caught Eric in a lie. "That's right," Eric replied, his tone measured. There was a pause, a moment where the tension in the room seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone within earshot. The other patrons had gone quiet, some watching with uncomfortable expressions, others choosing to look away entirely, as though witnessing this was something shameful, something better left unacknowledged. And then, without warning, Hadley's hand shot forward, tilting his coffee cup toward Eric, and before anyone could react, the hot liquid splashed across Eric's face, searing his skin. Gasps filled the room as the patrons realized what had just happened. Hadley took a step back, a smug grin on his face, watching Eric's reaction with a twisted sense of satisfaction. Eric's hand shot up to his face, feeling the heat and the sting, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he looked straight at Hadley, his eyes cold, unwavering. He felt the burn, but more than that, he felt the weight of the moment, the blatant injustice of it. This was no longer a casual encounter, no longer something he could simply brush off. This was personal, an attack not only on him but on everything he represented. In that instant, Eric understood the depth of Hadley's prejudice, the extent to which the officer felt entitled to humiliate someone he deemed inferior. And as he stood there, coffee dripping down his face, he knew that this was a line that could not be ignored, a moment that demanded accountability. The onlookers shifted, some muttering under their breath, others glancing at each other with expressions of shock and disbelief. No one dared speak up, not with Officer Hadley standing there, his smirk a clear sign of his satisfaction. He looked around the room, as if daring anyone to challenge him, to say something about what they had just witnessed. Eric held his gaze, his expression unreadable. Inside, he felt a storm brewing, a mix of anger and resolve, a sense that this moment would not go unanswered. He knew that walking away was no longer an option, not after the humiliation he'd just endured, not after seeing the officer's satisfaction in his actions. Hadley's smirk widened, as if he'd won some unspoken battle, as if he had successfully put Eric in his place. But he couldn't have been more wrong. Eric didn't leave the diner right away. He felt the stares from the patrons, their pity mingling with discomfort as they looked away, ashamed or fearful of what they'd just witnessed. But Eric wasn't about to let this go. He took a steadying breath, his mind focused, intent on handling the situation the right way, his way. The searing pain on his cheek and the sting of humiliation echoed through him, but he pushed it aside. He had learned, over years of facing prejudice, that patience could be a powerful weapon. Outside the diner, Eric calmly dabbed his face with a napkin he'd grabbed from the counter, trying to mask the visible burn. His mind raced, recalling the officer's smug, unapologetic expression. Hadley didn't seem like the type who acted on impulse alone, his aggression was deliberate, a performance of power. And for someone like that, facing real consequences was a rare and often unheard of event. As he stood by his car, gathering himself, a familiar voice called out. "Eric." He turned to see Jackson, his partner at the FBI, standing there with an expression that mixed concern and disbelief. Jackson had been in the area on a separate assignment and had witnessed enough of the encounter through the diner's window to understand what had happened. Did he really? Jackson's voice trailed off, his eyes on the faint redness on Eric's cheek. Eric nodded, still holding back the frustration boiling within him. He threw hot coffee on me, Jackson. Because I dared to exist in his line of sight. Jackson's fists clenched at his sides. We can't let this slide. You know that, right? Eric let out a slow breath. He knew Jackson was right. But this was about more than a personal vendetta, it was about principle, about standing up against a pattern of injustice, one that people like Hadley got away with time and time again. I know. But we need to be strategic about this, Eric replied, his voice firm. I'm not letting him get away with it. Not this time. Jackson studied him, sensing the determination in his friend's gaze. He nodded, understanding that this was bigger than one incident, it was a fight for respect, for dignity, for every person who'd ever been in Eric's shoes. The next morning, Eric walked into the FBI headquarters with a renewed sense of purpose. He headed straight to his supervisor, Agent Anderson, a man known for his fair-mindedness and unwavering support of his team. Eric explained the incident, detailing the events without letting emotion cloud his retelling. Anderson listened intently, his expression darkening as Eric spoke. So, you're saying Officer Hadley assaulted you unprovoked? He asked, his voice laced with disbelief and anger. That's exactly what I'm saying, sir. He saw me as a target, as someone he could humiliate without consequence, Eric replied, his voice steady. But I want to approach this carefully. I don't want this to be just another complaint that gets swept under the rug. Anderson nodded, his gaze hardening. I understand. This is serious, and we're not going to let him walk away from this without consequences. Leave it with me, Eric. We'll pursue this through official channels. Satisfied, Eric left the office, feeling a flicker of hope that justice might actually be within reach. But he wasn't naive, he knew that men like Hadley often had a way of slipping through the cracks, protected by a system designed to shield them. That thought weighed heavily on him, fueling his determination to see this through. Over the next few days, an investigation was launched. Witnesses from the diner were interviewed, recounting the event with a mix of shock and discomfort. Each of their testimonies painted a clear picture of Hadley's unprovoked aggression, of his smugness, his sense of invincibility. But even as these accounts piled up, Eric sensed the undercurrents of resistance, the unspoken hesitance that came with investigating one of their own. It wasn't long before Officer Hadley got wind of the inquiry. The realization that his actions were under scrutiny, that he might actually face repercussions, hit him like a brick. He paced his small office, his jaw clenched, feeling the weight of what he thought was a trivial incident bearing down on him. How dare this man, this outsider, challenge him, make him answer for his actions? In a frustrated huff, he turned to his friend and fellow officer, Tom. Tom was more reserved, known for keeping his head down, but he sympathized with Hadley's resentment toward the investigation. Can you believe this? Just because some guy felt insulted, my whole career's at stake, Hadley scoffed, slamming his fist onto his desk. Tom glanced around, cautious, then leaned closer. Look, Mike, maybe it wasn't the best move, but it's just a complaint. These things blow over. They always do. But Hadley's face twisted with indignation. This guy wants to ruin me, Tom. And he's got the power to do it. What if he knows people in higher places? He sneered, a mix of resentment and disbelief evident on his face. This is ridiculous. I was just doing my job. Who does he think he is? Tom placed a hand on his shoulder, trying to calm him. Look, let's wait it out. Keep your head down, stay quiet, and this will pass. It always does. But Eric was already several steps ahead. With his connections, he began reaching out to community leaders, individuals he'd worked with before on cases of discrimination and civil rights issues. He knew that bringing this incident into the public eye would create a pressure that couldn't easily be dismissed. He wanted this to be more than just a quiet investigation, he wanted people to see the truth, to understand the reality of those who faced men like Hadley daily. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. News of the incident spread beyond the FBI circles, reaching local media, sparking conversations about discrimination and abuse of power. Public opinion began to shift, with people in the community demanding accountability, calling for justice not only for Eric but for everyone who had been wronged by a system that allowed officers like Hadley to operate unchecked. Hadley began to feel the walls closing in, each headline, each news segment, a blow to his sense of invulnerability. He wasn't just facing repercussions within his precinct anymore, he was becoming a symbol of everything wrong with a flawed system. Each day, he grew more resentful, more desperate to find a way to stop the momentum building against him. One evening, as Eric sat at home, reviewing the notes he'd taken on the case, his phone rang. It was Jackson, his voice filled with an excitement Eric hadn't heard in weeks. "You're not going to believe this, Eric," Jackson said, barely able to contain himself. "They're calling for a public hearing. Hadley's going to have to answer for this. And it's not just going to be behind closed doors." Eric felt a surge of satisfaction. A public hearing would mean that everything, the humiliation, the abuse, the prejudice, would be laid bare, with no room for Hadley to hide behind his badge. It was a step toward justice, and it was more than he had expected. As the date for the hearing approached, tension grew on both sides. Hadley's allies rallied, some arguing that he was being unfairly targeted, that the situation was exaggerated. But Eric remained calm, focused, knowing that this was his chance to show the truth, to bring accountability to a man who had never faced it. The community was buzzing with anticipation, and even those who didn't know Eric personally felt connected to his cause, understanding that this wasn't just about one man but about a pattern of abuse that affected them all. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom was packed. Reporters, community leaders, and citizens filled the benches, waiting for what was sure to be a gripping confrontation. Hadley entered with a defiant expression, his jaw clenched, his gaze sweeping over the room as though he were searching for a way to escape. But Eric was there, too, standing tall, resolute, with Jackson and his supporters by his side. Hadley's lawyer began with a series of arguments designed to cast doubt on Eric's account, to paint him as overly sensitive, to minimize the incident. But the witnesses from the diner stood firm, recounting what they'd seen with unwavering clarity. Each detail, each word reinforced the reality of Hadley's actions. And as the hearing continued, with testimonies and cross-examinations, it became clear that this wasn't going in Hadley's favor. The officer's confidence began to waver, his smug arrogance replaced by an undeniable fear, a dawning realization that he might actually face consequences for his actions. Eric watched, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation, sensing that this was more than just a victory for him. It was a moment of reckoning, a step toward change, a chance to show that even those who thought they were untouchable could be held accountable. The hearing was far from over, and Eric knew that there were still battles to be fought, still questions to answer. But as he looked at Hadley's paling face, he felt a glimmer of hope, hope that this moment, this stand, would be the beginning of something larger. What he couldn't have anticipated, however, was just how far the repercussions would go, how deep the impact of this confrontation would be. The wheels were in motion, and there was no stopping what was to come next. In the packed courtroom, a thick silence blanketed the tension in the air. Rows upon rows of onlookers sat with bated breath, waiting to see the final confrontation between Eric Miller and Officer Mike Hadley. Reporters jotted down notes feverishly, community members murmured among themselves, and the occasional flash of a camera lit up the otherwise solemn atmosphere. For many, this was a case of justice, for some, it was a mirror reflecting years of untold stories, hidden prejudices, and buried injustices. Eric stood in the witness box, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the storm of emotions in his eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on Hadley, who sat across from him at the defense table. The officer's posture was rigid, his face carefully blank, but Eric could see the flickers of anger, frustration, and, yes, fear. This was not the position of power Hadley had grown accustomed to. Today, he was the one being questioned, judged. The prosecutor stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence. Mr. Miller, would you mind recounting, once more, what happened on the morning in question? Eric nodded, his voice steady as he spoke. I entered the diner for a cup of coffee, just as I'd done many times before. I was about to place my order when Officer Hadley approached me. He questioned why I was there, implied I didn't belong, and without provocation, threw his coffee in my face. A low murmur spread through the audience. Hadley's lawyer leaned in, whispering hurriedly to his client, but Hadley only clenched his jaw tighter, his gaze fixed on the floor. The prosecutor paused, letting the weight of Eric's words settle. And what was your immediate reaction? Eric exhaled, glancing briefly at his hands before looking back up. I was humiliated, shocked. I didn't retaliate. I left, but I knew this was something I couldn't ignore. For too long, people like Officer Hadley have abused their authority without facing any consequences. The defense attorney stood, a slick, confident man with an air of dismissive arrogance. He adjusted his tie before addressing Eric. Mr. Miller, are you suggesting that Officer Hadley acted out of some personal vendetta? The attorney's tone was mocking, a deliberate jab at Eric's stance. Eric held his gaze steady. I'm not suggesting anything. I'm stating what happened. And I believe Officer Hadley's actions were motivated by prejudice. The defense attorney scoffed, shaking his head. You're a highly trained FBI agent, Mr. Miller. Surely, you must understand that officers are often under stress, dealing with difficult people. Could it be that you were, in fact, uncooperative? Maybe he misread the situation. Eric's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. Uncooperative? I ordered a coffee. I answered his questions politely. If that's grounds for aggression, then perhaps Officer Hadley should reconsider his qualifications. Hadley's attorney started to object, but the judge silenced him with a single look. The prosecutor resumed her questioning, steering it toward Hadley's past conduct. Is it true, Mr. Miller, that Officer Hadley has faced similar complaints from other members of the community? Eric nodded. Yes, though most complaints were swept under the rug. This is a pattern, not an isolated incident. Hadley's face flushed, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. He knew his record was on the line. He'd been untouchable for years, but this case was unlike any other he'd faced. Eric was not just another citizen, he was someone with influence, someone who would not let this go without a fight. The prosecutor continued, unrelenting. We have records showing that Officer Hadley has had 3 previous complaints filed against him in similar incidents. Is that correct? Hadley's attorney sprang up, attempting to intervene. Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant to the specific incident we're discussing here. The judge considered, then allowed the prosecutor to proceed. I'll permit it. Let's see where this goes. The prosecutor leaned forward, her gaze locked on Hadley. Officer Hadley, would you care to explain these prior complaints? Because, to my understanding, they all have a similar narrative to what Mr. Miller has recounted. Hadley shifted uncomfortably, his voice defensive. Those were misunderstandings. I do my job by the book. Some people just don't appreciate it when they're called out on their behavior. Called out? The prosecutor's voice dripped with disbelief. These are citizens, Officer Hadley. Law-abiding people who reported feeling intimidated or harassed. Does that not concern you? Hadley's eyes flickered, but he maintained his composure. My job is to protect the community. Sometimes that means making people uncomfortable. The prosecutor leaned in, lowering her voice slightly. And did you feel that Mr. Miller's presence in the diner was a threat? Did you truly believe that throwing hot coffee at him was necessary to protect the community? For the first time, Hadley hesitated. The room went silent, all eyes trained on him as he struggled to find an answer. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Hadley brushed him off, choosing to speak for himself. He was disrespectful, Hadley muttered, his voice wavering. He had this attitude, like he was better than everyone else. Because he was polite? The prosecutor's voice held a hint of mockery. Or was it because he didn't fit into your idea of who belongs? Hadley's face flushed, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the prosecutor's questions. His silence was telling, a tacit admission of his bias, and the murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. Eric watched, his heart steady but his mind racing. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment when Hadley would be forced to confront the truth about his actions, to see the full weight of his prejudice laid bare for everyone to see. He could sense the change in the room, the shift from doubt to understanding, as people began to see Hadley for what he was. The defense attorney, seeing the tide turning, tried to regain control. Officer Hadley has served this community for years. He's been a reliable protector, respected by his peers. This incident is being blown out of proportion. The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. Respect doesn't excuse abuse. And reliability doesn't grant immunity from accountability. Officer Hadley's actions crossed a line that no one in uniform has the right to cross. The judge leaned forward, addressing both sides. I've heard enough for today. We'll resume tomorrow, at which point I'll make my decision. As the judge left, the room buzzed with energy, people whispering and exchanging glances. But Eric remained quiet, absorbing the gravity of what had just happened. He knew that the weight of public opinion was turning against Hadley, but he also understood that real change didn't happen overnight. He wanted more than just a personal victory, he wanted to set a precedent, to show that even those who thought themselves untouchable could be held accountable. After the session ended, Jackson approached Eric, clapping him on the shoulder. "You handled that brilliantly," he said, admiration evident in his tone. "You didn't let him get to you." Eric nodded, but his eyes held a deeper determination. "This isn't over. Not until there's real accountability." Outside the courthouse, a group of community members and activists had gathered, waiting for Eric. As he stepped outside, they erupted in cheers, rallying around him as a symbol of hope, a beacon of strength. He shook hands, exchanged words of gratitude, but he was keenly aware of the responsibility he now carried. People were looking to him, not just to win his case, but to be the voice for those who had been silenced. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the city, Eric felt a renewed sense of purpose. The hearing would resume in the morning, but he knew that regardless of the outcome, he had already won a victory. He had forced a man who had abused his authority to answer for his actions, had shined a light on a reality many chose to ignore. The next day, the courtroom was packed to capacity. The judge entered, calling the court to order, and everyone settled into an expectant silence. Eric sat with his attorney, his mind clear, focused. Today would be the day of reckoning, the moment when the scales would finally tip. The prosecutor made her closing statement, her words resonant and powerful. She spoke of justice, of accountability, of the need for law enforcement to protect rather than harm. And as she spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath, captivated by the vision of a world where people like Hadley could no longer hide behind their badges. When it was time for Hadley to speak, he stood, his hands shaking slightly, his once arrogant gaze now downcast. For the first time, he looked vulnerable, stripped of the shield he had used to hide behind. I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I let my assumptions get the better of me. And for that, I'm sorry." The apology was hollow, empty, a mere attempt to salvage what little dignity he had left. But the courtroom remained silent, unmoved by his words. They had seen his true nature, his callous disregard for those he deemed unworthy, and his words did little to change that perception. The judge's gaze was stern as he addressed Hadley. "Officer Hadley, this court finds your actions to be inexcusable. You abused the authority entrusted to you, and in doing so, you have not only harmed Mr. Miller but have damaged the trust between law enforcement and this community." A murmur of approval rippled through the room as the judge announced Hadley's suspension from the force, pending a full investigation. But more than that, Hadley's reputation was shattered, his career in ruins, his status as an untouchable authority dismantled in a single, powerful moment of accountability. Eric left the courtroom that day, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Justice had been served, and while the journey had been long and fraught with tension, he knew it had been worth it. As he walked out, surrounded by supporters and friends, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. What Hadley had once thought would be a fleeting moment of humiliation had become a turning point, a powerful reminder that no one, not even those who wear a badge, is above the law. As the judge delivered his verdict, a profound silence filled the courtroom. Hadley sat in stunned disbelief, his usually sharp, assertive demeanor replaced by a numb stare. His mind reeled, replaying every decision, every word he had spoken, every action he had justified over the years. And now, here he was, suspended, his career, and the respect he'd clung to, dangling by a thread. He felt the eyes of everyone around him, no longer seeing him as the figure of power he'd believed himself to be. Eric watched Hadley's reaction closely, not out of vengeance but out of a need to see if the officer truly understood the weight of his actions. But Hadley's silence was neither regretful nor apologetic, it was resentful. The tension between them, though unspoken, was palpable. Eric knew that, even in this moment of defeat, Hadley wasn't likely to accept responsibility, to reflect on the harm he had caused. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered was waiting, a mix of supporters for Eric and community members who had come to witness the long-awaited accountability. As Eric exited the building, a series of murmurs and whispers swept through the crowd, the weight of what had just transpired settling heavily on everyone present. Eric's friend and partner, Jackson, was waiting just outside the door. He reached over, giving Eric's shoulder a firm squeeze. "Man, you did it," he said quietly, admiration clear in his voice. "You've shown everyone that people like Hadley can't just get away with this anymore." Eric nodded, feeling a blend of relief and exhaustion. "I did what I had to do," he replied, his gaze drifting to the crowd. "This isn't just about me, Jackson. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did." Jackson's face softened, and he looked around at the people gathering, the voices of those who'd been hurt or wronged echoing through the crowd. "You're right. And they're here because they see that. They see that things can change." Just then, there was a commotion behind them. Officer Hadley, now free to leave the courtroom, had stepped out, and the crowd's energy shifted, the voices around him growing colder, more intense. Some people murmured angrily, others called out in frustration, their faces reflecting years of pent-up resentment toward officers like Hadley. "Look at him," someone said, shaking their head. "Now he knows what it feels like to be powerless." Hadley shot the crowd a glare, his pride flaring up despite everything he'd just lost. He stepped forward, trying to appear unaffected, but the discomfort in his expression betrayed him. It was clear that he was not used to being seen this way, to being the target of public scrutiny. He had spent his career controlling situations, judging others, and now he was forced to face the reality he'd always dismissed. Eric took a deep breath, feeling a need to confront Hadley one last time, to make sure he understood the full weight of his actions. He stepped forward, the crowd parting slightly, sensing the tension that hung between the two men. Hadley's eyes met Eric's, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence was thick with unresolved resentment, anger, and perhaps, buried deep within, a sliver of understanding. "Why did you do it, Hadley?" Eric asked quietly, his voice steady but carrying a note of intensity that made Hadley flinch. "Why did you feel entitled to treat me, and others, like we didn't matter? Like we were beneath you?" Hadley scoffed, attempting to mask his discomfort with defiance. "You think you're some kind of hero?" he shot back, his voice dripping with bitterness. "All you did was ruin my career." "For what?" "Because I didn't cower when you walked in." Eric shook his head, his expression calm but resolute. "This was never about you cowering, Hadley. It was about respect, something you never showed me, or anyone else you thought you could control. You threw that coffee, not because I did anything wrong, but because you saw me as less than you. And that's not something I can let slide. Hadley's jaw tightened, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. You have no idea what it's like to be me, to walk into work every day and deal with people who hate you, who look at you like you're the enemy just because of your badge. Eric's gaze softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. You're right, Hadley. I don't know what it's like to wear a badge and carry that weight. But I know what it's like to walk into a room and be seen as a threat for something I didn't choose. I know what it's like to have people assume they know who I am just because of the color of my skin. The crowd fell silent, absorbing Eric's words, the truth behind them sinking in. Hadley shifted uncomfortably, his defiance faltering. You're going to have to face what you did, Hadley, Eric continued, his voice unwavering. You may not lose your badge permanently, but you'll carry this with you. People are watching now, and you can't hide behind your uniform anymore. Hadley's eyes flickered with resentment, a flicker of guilt buried beneath his anger. For a brief second, his face softened, as if he wanted to speak, to defend himself, or perhaps, to admit something. But the moment passed, and his face hardened once more. This doesn't change anything, Hadley muttered, his voice low and cold. You think one case is going to change the world? People will forget. They always do. Eric looked at him, sadness and determination mingling in his gaze. Maybe people forget names, Hadley. But they don't forget moments like this. This is bigger than you or me. As the crowd murmured in agreement, Jackson stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Eric's shoulder. Come on, man, he said softly. You've said what needed to be said. Let him go. Eric nodded, feeling the weight of the encounter lifting. He turned away, the crowd parting to let him through, their admiration and respect evident in their faces. Hadley watched him go, his expression a mixture of anger and something else, something he wasn't ready to admit, even to himself. He looked down at his hands, seeing the faint tremor in his fingers, the unsettling realization that his actions had consequences after all. As Eric walked away, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't anticipated. The journey to justice had been difficult, painful, but he had faced it with integrity, with a commitment to doing what was right. And as he glanced back at the courthouse, the crowd still watching, he knew that this moment would be remembered, not just by him but by everyone who had witnessed it. Jackson walked beside him, a faint smile on his face. You did good, Eric, he said quietly, his voice filled with respect. You took a stand when most people would have let it go. Eric shrugged, his expression thoughtful. I didn't do it just for me, Jackson. I did it for everyone who's been in my shoes, for everyone who's been made to feel small, less than. And I hope that, maybe, this will make people think twice. They continued walking, the echoes of the courtroom fading behind them. But in Eric's heart, he knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new journey, a journey toward change, toward accountability, toward a world where respect was more than just a word, but a lived reality for everyone. As the sun set, casting a golden light over the city, Eric and Jackson stood side by side, both knowing that they had witnessed something powerful, something that would linger in their memories and in the memories of everyone who had been there. It was a day of reckoning, a day of truth. And as they walked away, they carried with them a renewed sense of purpose, of hope for a future where no one would ever have to stand alone in the face of injustice. As Eric and Jackson walked away from the courthouse, the impact of the day's events began to settle. They could still hear the voices and murmurs from the crowd behind them, but Eric's thoughts were focused on what lay ahead. This case had shown the public a reality many often ignored, but he knew it was only the beginning. There were deeper issues to address, larger systems at play that allowed officers like Hadley to act without fear of consequence. Jackson's voice broke the silence as they walked down the steps. You know this isn't just about one man, right? He asked, his tone thoughtful. Hadley was the tip of the iceberg. There are plenty more like him, hidden under layers of authority and blind loyalty. Eric nodded, his gaze far away. I know, Jackson. But the truth is, if people don't see consequences, nothing will ever change. Today was about showing that no one is above accountability. Eric's phone buzzed, and he pulled it from his pocket, glancing at the screen. It was a message from a community leader he'd worked with in the past, thanking him for his bravery and promising support in future endeavors. As he read, a new sense of responsibility began to weigh on him. He was no longer just an FBI agent, he was now a figure of change, someone people looked to as a symbol of strength and resilience. The media quickly seized on the story, covering it from every angle. News outlets played footage from the courthouse steps, photos of Hadley looking defeated and visibly shaken by the verdict. Eric's quiet strength, his unyielding resolve in the face of injustice, became a rallying point for communities far beyond the courthouse steps. But not everyone was supportive. Behind closed doors, Eric began to feel the pressure from his superiors at the FBI. They were wary of the attention his case had drawn, concerned that the agency was now seen as antagonistic toward local law enforcement. He was called into meetings with upper management, where his motives were questioned, and warnings were hinted at in vague, indirect terms. One morning, as he sat across from his division chief, Agent Anderson, he could see the tension in the older man's face. Anderson had always been fair to him, but this case had put them both in a difficult position. "Eric," Anderson began, folding his hands on the desk, "you know that what you did took courage. But there are people who aren't happy with how public this has become. The agency is under pressure to distance itself from this spectacle." Eric's jaw tightened, though he kept his voice calm. "With all due respect, sir, this isn't just about the agency's image. It's about setting a precedent, about showing that no one in a position of authority should be immune to the same laws they're supposed to uphold." Anderson sighed, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I get it, Eric. But you have to understand, this kind of attention isn't good for the agency. It could affect our relationships with local law enforcement, complicate investigations." Eric leaned forward, his tone unwavering. "Complicate investigations? Or complicate the lives of people who are being mistreated? We're supposed to protect people, sir. That's why I took this job, and I can't turn a blind eye just because it's inconvenient." The tension in the room was thick, each man caught between duty and conscience. Anderson looked at him, considering his words, before finally nodding, though reluctantly. "I can't say I disagree, Eric. But be careful. You've stirred the waters, and that can make powerful people uneasy." Eric understood the warning, but he knew he couldn't back down. As he left Anderson's office, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. There would always be those who wanted to maintain the status quo, who feared the ripple effects of accountability. But if he didn't stand firm now, all the courage, all the sacrifice, would be for nothing. Days passed, and the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. Journalists reached out for interviews, community leaders asked him to speak at rallies, and messages poured in from people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and mistreatment. It was overwhelming, but Eric understood the importance of each story, each voice that had been silenced for too long. One afternoon, Eric received an unexpected visitor at his office. A young woman, her face etched with tension and determination, introduced herself as Nina Clark. She was Hadley's daughter, and there was a fierceness in her eyes that Eric recognized, one born of anger and frustration but also of resilience. "Mr. Miller," she began, her voice steady despite the emotions beneath it, "I wanted to talk to you about my father." Eric nodded, gesturing for her to sit. He didn't know what to expect, but he sensed that whatever she had to say would be significant. Nina looked down at her hands, gathering her thoughts. "I know my father isn't a good man," she said finally, her voice laced with a mixture of pain and defiance. "I grew up watching him treat people horribly, the way he looked at people who didn't look like him, but he was my father. And part of me always wanted to believe he could change." Eric listened, his gaze steady as she continued. "When this happened," Nina went on, "when you brought his actions to light, I was angry, not at you, but at him. I had hoped, that maybe he'd finally see what he was doing, that he'd take responsibility. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. But he hasn't changed. If anything, he's just angrier. He blames you, he blames everyone but himself. Eric sighed, understanding the complexity of her emotions. He'd seen it before, the way family members struggled with the actions of loved ones who chose a path of hate. It was a difficult burden to bear, to love someone while recognizing the harm they inflicted on others. Nina, Eric said gently, change is something he has to want for himself. No one can force him to see what he's done. But your willingness to face the truth, to acknowledge it, that takes strength. She looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Thank you for that, she replied softly. I just wanted you to know that, not everyone in his family is like him. Some of us see what he's done, and we don't condone it. Eric gave her a small, understanding nod. I appreciate that, Nina. It takes courage to confront things like this, especially when it's someone close to you. Nina hesitated, then took a deep breath. I'm leaving the city, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I can't stay here and watch him spiral further. I need to make my own path, away from his shadow. Eric could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of her decision. But he also saw hope, the spark of someone who refused to let another's darkness define her. I wish you the best, Nina, he said, his tone warm. You deserve to find peace, to build a life free from all of this. As she stood to leave, she looked back at him, a mixture of sadness and resolve in her expression. Thank you, Eric. For everything. I hope you keep fighting, for people like us. As she walked out, Eric felt a surge of empathy for her. Her story, like so many others, was part of the larger narrative he was fighting for, the right for everyone to be seen, respected, and treated with dignity. The case continued to echo throughout the community, stirring conversations and debates, dividing opinions but also inspiring hope for change. Eric knew that real progress wouldn't happen overnight, that dismantling prejudice required more than just one court case. But as he looked around at the people who supported him, at the voices that had joined his cause, he knew they were building a foundation. One evening, as he sat alone in his office, sifting through the many letters and emails he'd received, Jackson entered, his face thoughtful. You've done a lot, Eric, Jackson said, his voice filled with admiration. But do you ever wonder what's next? I mean, this was a huge battle, but it feels like there's so much more to fight for. Eric leaned back, considering his friend's words. I do wonder, Jackson. I know this is just one step, but it's a necessary one. People need to see that accountability is possible, that there are consequences for actions like Hadley's. Jackson nodded, a flicker of determination in his eyes. So, what are we going to do about it? Because I'm in, man. Whatever it takes. Eric smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. We keep pushing. We keep fighting. Not just for ourselves but for everyone who's been silenced, overlooked, pushed aside. This is bigger than us. As they sat there, talking into the night, they knew that their journey was far from over. The victory they'd won was significant, but it was only the beginning. The fight for justice, for equality, was a long road, and they were just getting started. In the weeks that followed, the reverberations of Eric's case against Officer Hadley spread beyond the confines of their city. What had started as a quiet morning in a local diner had grown into a national conversation about justice, integrity, and the power of accountability. The case had exposed the underlying prejudice within the ranks, and it had ignited something much larger, a call to action, a demand that justice be served equally, without favoritism or fear. Hadley, after the hearing, found himself suspended indefinitely. His once unshakable confidence was shattered, his reputation in ruins. He was no longer the proud, untouchable officer who commanded respect in his community. Instead, he was a symbol of abuse of power, a cautionary tale for others who might consider using their position to demean rather than protect. As weeks passed, the city's police department announced a renewed commitment to review policies, ensure fair treatment, and foster a culture of integrity. For Hadley, the consequences were both public and private. Friends he had once trusted turned away, uncomfortable with being associated with him. His family, embarrassed and exhausted by the fallout, distanced themselves, and for the first time in his life, Hadley felt the loneliness that often accompanies the misuse of power. He had lost more than just a badge, he'd lost the respect he'd spent his life demanding but never truly earned. Nina, his daughter, had left the city as she'd planned, her departure quiet but resolute. In her new life, she became involved in community work, striving to ensure that stories like Eric's were heard, remembered, and prevented. Her experiences had transformed her anger and pain into a fierce resolve, and she found herself advocating for fairness and change in her own way. It was a path she hadn't anticipated, but one that gave her a sense of peace and purpose. Eric's journey, however, was just beginning. With the case closed, he returned to his life as an FBI agent, but things had shifted. His colleagues regarded him with newfound respect, recognizing that he had done what many feared to do, he had confronted power with integrity. His work began to reflect this change, his cases now taking on a deeper meaning as he became a voice for those who had none. The impact of his actions rippled outward, affecting lives he would never even know about. He became a mentor to younger agents, encouraging them to approach their work with the same courage and purpose, to remember that their duty was to protect, not intimidate. One day, Eric received a letter. It was from a young man, a stranger, who had followed his story in the news. The letter thanked him for his courage, for standing up against injustice, for showing that people in positions of authority could be held accountable. The word struck Eric deeply, and he realized that his story had become a beacon for others, a reminder that no one should be afraid to stand up for what was right. A few months later, Eric was invited to speak at a national forum on justice and reform. His speech was humble, but powerful, focusing not on his own experiences but on the broader need for accountability and respect within the ranks of law enforcement. He shared his hope for a world where power was used responsibly, where communities felt protected, not threatened, and where respect was a foundational part of every badge worn. As he left the stage, the applause was deafening. People from all walks of life approached him, sharing their stories, their gratitude, their own dreams of a just world. Eric felt a profound sense of fulfillment, a quiet satisfaction that went beyond any recognition or applause. This, he realized, was his legacy, not just as an agent, but as a man who had dared to stand up when it mattered most. In the end, the diner incident had become more than just a personal victory or a courtroom case, it had sparked a movement, a change that would resonate long after the last headline had faded. Eric returned home that evening, the weight of his journey lifting with each step, knowing he had made a difference, not just for himself, but for countless others. This story reminds us of the power of standing up, even when the odds feel insurmountable. Eric's journey was not easy, and he faced many risks. But his story is a testament to what can happen when courage and integrity meet. He chose to confront injustice head-on, and by doing so, he inspired countless others. Imagine if we all had the courage to confront wrongs in our daily lives, to stand up for what's right. How different could our world be? As we look back on Eric's journey, we're left with a question: what would you do in his shoes? How far would you go to protect what you believe in, to stand up for yourself and others, to ensure that justice isn't just a word but a reality? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of stories to inspire and bring about change, please consider subscribing to Tales of Twist. There's more to come, and we'd be honored to have you with us on this journey.